Hello, we are starting our first episode of the podcast series, which we are doing through Caucasian House and about the conflict, peace topics. And the first topic which we have at the moment is about the transitional justice and dealing with the past. And we have Ulrike Lühe, who is a doctor, and she's now studying at postdoctoral. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the School of Information at the University of British Columbia, and she has an extensive academic background on the topic which I mentioned. Thank you, Ulrike, for joining us. I myself, I'm the head of the peace program at Tbilisi-based or civil society organization, research organization called Caucasian House, and we have been working since the 1990s about the conflicts in the Caucasus region, and this is a very much conflict-affected region with a lot of ethnic groups, grievances, and so on, still unresolved till today. So all of these discussions which we are going to have will be very much appreciated, I'm sure, all across the region. So thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this podcast.
Thank you. The first question which we have is, what do the dealing with the past and transitional justice mean, and how are they actually interconnected? If you can say briefly about that.
Thank you. So I'll maybe just, in a broad sense,
Yes.
for the sake of an overview, we understand transitional justice as the types of mechanisms, processes, institutions that help people as individuals, but also as communities and as, I would say, society overall, to move from violence towards a more peaceful future. So this violence could be in terms of violent conflict, authoritarian rule, colonialism. I think we often sometimes forget in this whole conversation. Yeah. So all of these sort of are obviously marked by really impactful experiences that really break relations in a society, that do long-term, severe and very deep forms of harm. And the idea is that those kinds of harms and wounds need to be addressed in order to be able to move forward towards a different kind of future that is less violent, ideally very peaceful. And one can argue around what that peace then should look like in any given society. And really it is the idea that these kinds of experiences need long-term, or experiences of long-term severe systematic violence need adequate types of responses in order to overcome them. And so there's some mechanisms that we usually sort of referred to as part of transitional justice. So there is different forms of accountability and justice seeking. I think the most common ones are trials, whether they are sort of national, regional, or international trials and official justice mechanisms. But we've also seen quite successful and impactful cases of very localized justice mechanisms. So in Uganda and Rwanda, for example, we've seen communities really in charge of establishing a sense of justice and truth-seeking because the official justice system maybe either isn't able, willing to deal with the perpetrators, or because there's too many of them. That's maybe the justice or accountability aspect. Very important are also reparations. These come in many, many different forms. So we have what we call symbolic and material reparations. So one is quite literally payments or material services. But on a more symbolic level, it has a lot to do with recognition and allowing a sense of, for victims, victim communities to be seen, for their pain to be recognized. So that's a form of repair in itself. And this can take place at an individual or a collective level. It could be educational opportunities being reinstated as part of reparation processes, for example, as well. Another so-called pillar of transitional justice or dealing with the past is truth-seeking. So the idea that civil society, the international community, and other actors that have a stake in the transition try to sort of lay open what happened, because sometimes violence takes place in secret or in invisible ways that the public might not always be aware of, or the depth and severity of the violence isn't known. Part of truth-seeking is also to uncover the causes, but also the consequences of this kind of violence and human rights violations. So the goals of this truth-seeking, I think, are trying to shed light on really the pain and the violence, is that partly a recognition that we need to know what happened in order to be able to move forward from it. Then there's the fact that people have a right to know what happened, the right to know. And so that also then responds, I think, to the idea that it's an attempt to prevent denialism and historical revisionism. So the more we know, the harder it is to say it didn't happen, or people simply don't know what happened, and so we don't have to deal with that past. A fourth, what is often called the fourth pillar of transitional justice, is guarantees of non-recurrence, or the idea to use dealing with the past in order to prevent the same kinds of violence and violations from happening in the future. So the idea is to put certain mechanisms in place to reform the institutions of the state, whether this is in the educational sector, in the justice system, the armed forces, and disarmament, really the structural reforms that hopefully can bring in a different kind of capacity to deal with conflict, because any society has conflict, and to keep it from turning towards violence. And to, obviously, in cases where the state is involved in the violence, to avoid or prevent that from happening in the future. Now, the previous UN Special Rapporteur for the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, guarantees of non-recurrence also postulated memorialization as its own kind of pillar of transitional justice. Others would argue that this is part of non-recurrence or reparations. So there's sort of different ways of thinking about this, but those are some of the key aspects that we often have in mind when talking about transitional justice. I think it's important that not all of it has to be driven by the state or have to be official institutions. Some of it can be really driven by civil society. By a lot of this work, I think, also happens from people themselves, just through the act of rebuilding life. And so there's also the term dealing with the past, which I think draws our attention a bit more towards an open-ended process, because it's not just transition, right?
Yes.
Like not just this period.
I actually wanted to ask, this is great that you touched this question here. I mean, who has the legitimacy actually to lead this transitional justice? Because is it just a winner takes it all situation? Like, is it the kind of the winner who leads this, or should it be the people who have the high legitimacy in the societies, spiritual leaders, or anyone, or how can it be led in a right way? Who has the right legitimacy? Yeah, whether it's like political party or what's your experience and kind of the research kind of experience on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good and important and kind of difficult question.
Yeah.
I think one thing to acknowledge is that transitional justice pursues a lot of very idealistic goals. Justice, reconciliation, peace, those are big things, right? Like big concepts and big goals for a society to try to achieve. And at the same time, it is always negotiated. It always comes out of a compromise in a situation where resources are limited, the sort of political maneuvering space and what can realistically be done are very limited. And I think that also sort of leads to the question of who has legitimacy to lead transitional justice. I think there are many stakeholders, many people and groups and institutions that have a stake in transitional justice, and I think each of them can take very legitimate leadership roles. I think we tend to think of the government or the state, maybe the international community, as the drivers of transitional justice, but I think it's worth opening that up. And certainly we have to acknowledge that there are some actors that have something to answer for in a transitional justice process. And so if they are absent or if they are seen to be reluctant, I think that can really undermine transitional justice. And sometimes that is governments, for example, that will not hold themselves accountable if there hasn't been a transition, for example. And so, yes, it is true that transitional justice benefits from strong political leadership, from very visible support from the top. I think South Africa is a very good example of this. I think the Truth Commission could not have done the work it did if it weren't for people like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, that really very visibly brought the government and the state on board with the conversation. But at the same time, I also think we have cases where those in power aren't taking the lead, or they're even sort of actively delegitimizing the process. And then I think there is, in those cases, we have processes, initiatives that can be driven by a range of other actors. Some of those that you have mentioned, religious leaders, local authorities, trade unions, the business sector sometimes can have a role in this, NGOs, human rights defenders. There's a whole range of issues, or actors, that sometimes the international community with actors like the International Criminal Court, which isn't always seen as very legitimate, but there are cases where if there is a strong demand for justice and the ICC is the only actor filling that space, it can enjoy a lot of legitimacy. So I think it really depends on the specific context and what is needed, and finding those stakeholders that have the willpower, the necessary resources, whether, not just financial, but also of other types, to drive a process, and that have the authority and legitimacy to do so.
Yeah. So I guess it also is very much dependent on the political system, which is in the society, in the country, because the true, let's say, and the genuine dealing with the past and transitional justice can only take place in a democratic environment. Right? Can it be generalized like this?
I think having a democratic environment can be very beneficial for transitional justice processes, because I think in a way transitional justice mechanisms and processes, they reflect to a certain extent the environment they take place in. So I think you're more likely to see successful transitional justice if certain contextual factors enable this to happen.
Yeah.
So it reflects that. At the same time, you want transitional justice to enable that kind of, it's one step on the path towards peace and democracy and all of those things that we think of as what a peaceful future should look like. So I think part of why I'm hesitating is that we've seen people drive justice and reconciliation where democracy isn't very strong, where they are politically, economically, socially excluded from the central government, for example. In northern Uganda, communities did a lot of work to reconcile returnees that had been abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army back into the communities with its own challenges, but it took place in a space where the government was absent from these efforts. And the other part of why I'm hesitant is that democracies aren't always very good at reckoning with their own past.
Okay.
I think Germany is somewhat selective in it deals with certain aspects of its past, Second World War, the Holocaust, but has been very reluctant to look at its colonial past, for example. There's been a lot of demand from Namibia for reparations, and the German government is just really dragging its feet on it. And so I think in settler colonies in Canada, it took a really long time for any of these processes to really be able to unfold. So it's not, I think democracy is not necessarily the only thing that it's not an automatic assurance that transitional justice will succeed or be even implemented.
One can even look at the whole thing as whether actually it's the right dealing with the past process which can actually generate more democratic society. So it's like chicken and egg situation sometimes. But as you said, it really depends on the context. But my next question would be whether dealing with the past only comes with the benefits, or does it comes any risks? I mean, because here in our region, we have a lot of debates whether do we need to unpack and unfold and dig into our past, which might be slightly selectively even forgotten. I mean, do we need to kind of reignite another wave of conflict on this, or can it reignite conflict if we look at if we seek the truth, as you mentioned, right? If you start this truth-seeking process, because it can bring up a lot of crimes, a lot of let's say secret stories and so on. So does this dealing with the past and transitional justice comes with any serious risks?
I think it very much can. So I think we tend to think of the goals of transitional justice, again, justice, reconciliation, as being so important and so appealing that we sometimes don't pay enough attention to potential, I think, negative consequences or effects. And there can be many reasons for these types of negative consequences. It can be a lack of opportunity, that the context just isn't ready, and transitional justice is trying to do something too ambitious, or that transitional justice is being intentionally instrumentalized. But I think also in post-conflict, post-authoritarian context, sometimes circumstances just change very quickly and very dramatically, and so it might not have been foreseeable that suddenly a truth commission takes place in an active conflict instead of in a transition moment. And so all of these things hold potential, I think, for negative consequences. And there has been research that has shown that it can increase polarization because it brings up uncomfortable truths, right? Like if these things were easy to deal with and easily solved, we wouldn't need to be doing this kind of work. And it can be used, transitional justice can be used to neutralize political opponents, which can be very problematic. And different mechanisms can also, among themselves, have competing goals. So if you think of a truth commission, the whole sort of purpose of it is to uncover the truth and make it publicly known and bring it out into the open, but that can rip open wounds that haven't been healed. It can expose crimes, perpetrators, as you've said, that haven't previously been exposed and that feel threatened or are suddenly at risk of accountability. And so all of that can lead to new violence and repression. So I do think it is very important to be aware of potential risks and to take them seriously. But that is not to say that transitional justice shouldn't happen or that its goals aren't worth pursuing. And I think that's really important. To me, being aware of the risks means to try to very carefully calibrate any transitional justice or dealing with the past process. Again, it's negotiated, and I think it needs to be realistic and take the different realities into account, whether these are economic or political power distributions and so on. So contextual factors like the balance of powers, as I've mentioned, what the different stakeholders are ready for, and whether these are political stakeholders, different political parties or warring factions, or whether that is really the people on the ground. I think it's really trying to figure out what can be done at any given point in time. And what we end up with often is a sequence of things over shorter and longer periods of time. There's the immediate transition moment where things are incredibly fragile and where transitional justice might have to be as minimal as possible in order to unlock the transition itself, to be able to do more further down the line and not hinder peace or, a movement away from authoritarianism. So, and then later on, sometimes decades later, you have the opportunity to do this, the truth-seeking and the trials and the justice mechanisms. So it really, I think, depends a lot on where a society, where the political system is at.
Sure.
And it's a very fine balance, I think, that is really hard to strike between being ambitious and somewhat idealistic, because those are, in the end, some of the goals we want to pursue, and at the same time being very realistic and very contextual, and trying not to make false promises and raise false expectations, because that's very dangerous in itself.
Sure. Now I want to move a bit on a, let's say, classically conflict-affected societies in a way, not internally within like civil conflict or something like this, but maybe like inter-ethnic group or something like this, like where we have like two sides, like quite visible two sides or even more. So is it genuinely possible to have a confidence building between these conflict affected societies without dealing with the past and transitional justice? Can it? The question is like, can this confidence building be only oriented on future without addressing this, let's say, past grievances?
Okay, so I think there's two ways to look at it.
Yeah.
I think the one is to sort of, how do you define and understand transitional justice?
Yeah.
And I think if we understand it in terms of only some of the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, these types of official government-driven processes with truth commissions and trials and maybe some official memorialization discourse, then I think, yes, there can be confidence building without transitional justice. And in a way, I think building such confidence might be a precondition for transitional justice to be able to be unlocked.
Sure.
I think it's very unlikely to have genuine truth-seeking, for example, without there being some form of trust and confidence between the different parties. That
some kind of agreement, proceeding.
Something, yeah. And I think that it's partly about formal agreements, sort of the rules, setting up the rules of the game and the rules of the conversation that is about to unfold. But it's also about encounters between people. And I think sometimes we tend to think about the institutions, but a lot of this is about people. Sitting at a table, getting to know each other and seeing sides that they haven't seen before, or being able to build connections that they hadn't had before, or meeting on a different level than what was possible to them before. And I think that goes sort of on the high political levels and in terms of leadership, but also individuals that might maybe, in Rwanda you had neighbors fighting each other, and teachers and school children and things. So really interpersonal, very intimate relationships being affected by violence, and that requires a lot of work and groundwork to be able to rebuild some sort of trust and confidence and being able to live with each other again. And so I think in a way, confidence building is necessary as a stepping stone towards transitional justice, but I think we can also think of transitional justice as a broader process, more than these institutions and a politically led process. And then, to me, it's then almost an integral part of that. Can we really expect to do any of this work without there being any sort of most basic level of trust and confidence between people and communities? And so I think, yes, the Truth Commission can contribute to building that trust, but if there isn't something in place, formal, informal mechanisms, conversations, to enable these difficult conversations, then I think, it's one of the factors that I think can help a successful transition process, perhaps.
Sure. Another question which I have in this regard is whether, a lot of it became quite, let's say, popular saying these days that it takes two to tango. So what if in these conflict-affected societies one is not willing, but another one is? So does it still has a value if there is a one-sided, or does it have some kind of the at least internal peace making value to have at least one-sided process, as also the message to the other side that, look at me, I'm trying to do something here. So does it still has a value, or can it be genuine, let's say, if there is no other side willing to cooperate?
I suppose that depends on the particular configuration. But I do think, I think sometimes that comes out of necessity.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to say let's not do transitional justice because we can't have everybody who should be on board right away.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's part of that sequencing. Maybe the party that can't or won't have this conversation right now will in 10, 20 years. And so we shouldn't not do what we can right now because not everybody is willing to participate. And so I think the other side to that, maybe the cautionary side, I think, is that an actor might be very willing and proactive about holding the other side of the political spectrum accountable, but not themselves. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it's a sort of instrumentalization of transitional justice that is very problematic, potentially quite dangerous. And that really, depends on context of whether that's going to do more harm or whether that can still be a useful preliminary step towards having all sides reflected in the process. Does that make sense?
It does. It does, really, yeah. And because we, in this particular context in our region, this is also a debatable subject, whether itself the transitional justice without the other sides being present, does it has a value or not? Or can it be in parallel without even cooperating on this? So this is definitely an interesting kind of discussion which we're having at the moment. And for us, it's also quite contextual. We talk about a lot on the education. And I want to ask you, how does this symbolism, which you mentioned also, and this dealing with the past, finds its way to the education system?
I think
and you can name a few cases if you want, which you had kind of researched or had on the path of your academic work.
I think there's different mechanisms. I think there is a very intentional effort by the government to restructure education systems so that the past in all its complexity and with its violent parts becomes reflected in the official curriculum. So there is rewriting school books and history books and all of that, restructuring the makeup of the teaching force, for example, right? Diversifying who can be a teacher in a country, things like that, if you think of South Africa. I think there's also often in Germany, South Africa, and in different contexts, really less government-driven, more civil society-driven kinds of efforts to provide educational materials of a whole range of natures to diversify the way we can talk about and that the past is taught. So in Germany, I think we had a lot of survivors of the Holocaust, of the concentration camps, go to schools, directly talk about their experiences.
So the human stories, let's say.
Exactly, the human stories. And that can take very different forms, right? It can be people going to schools directly. It could be recordings, podcasts, interviews, books. There's so many different formats in which, and it's also outside of the school system. It's not just the school system where these conversations, I think, and this kind of education needs to happen. Interactive types of online platforms that we see these days where people can learn about the past in very different perspectives, museums, archives, all of them are part of this education effort. And I think it's also the creative industries and the arts have an important role to play, right, in terms of producing documentaries, producing art, producing exhibitions, museums, and creating these spaces where people are confronted with that conversation. This is memorial sites. But all of that is part of educating the public and not just the young people and school children, educating the public really towards this idea of it cannot be denied, you cannot claim ignorance anymore. And that's I think it's a hard battle. I think Germany has been trying to do this work for a long time on really different formats, and we're still having to grapple with forms of denialism or revisionism that, it's a small part of our history, we shouldn't be paying attention to that anymore. And so it takes, again, I think it takes a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different kinds of activities to move towards that. And it's, I don't know if I want to say a never-ending process, but it's certainly a very, very long-term endeavor.
Yeah.
But a lot of it can happen even if the formal education system doesn't quite yet make that move.
Yeah. A more, let's say, philosophical question from my side would be, today when everyone kind of has a sense that we live in a post-truth society and kind of epoch, the things which we thought were undeniable are being denied. So I want to ask you, like, how strong do we feel that the transitional justice has reached its goal in our societies, or whether we, in the context where we think it was successful or not? So can it be actually revised from a very political point of view, from a very populist point of view? And is it partly the case what we see all across the kind of popular, let's say, among the popular politicians, that they are revising these things that we thought were unrevisable? Yeah. Mm-hmm. From a more, let's say, different question, let's say, then, yeah.
It's a very important question, I think, especially at the sort of the political moment we find ourselves in. And I think it's interesting because transitional justice has such a claim on establishing the truth.
Yeah.
And I think there is a challenge there in saying we need to establish the truth, but we also need to give space to different truths. That's some of the nuance of what transitional justice, I think, has to do, is to be able to give space to some set of different narratives about the past, because people are differently affected, they have different experiences, and it might not always be beneficial to have one truth. At the same time, that does not mean we want to encourage or give space to denialism and revisionism, right? And exactly what you're saying, what we're seeing now with some political actors, either undermining the premise of what happened, or whether the importance of it, or whether we still need to be dealing with those pasts and the effects. And I think transitional justice always moves against a background, against a broader context.
Mm-hmm.
And it always has to actively maintain this conversation and the work. Like, I think this kind of work that's what I was saying, like, it's never done.
Yeah.
Never is a really long time, but for decades and sometimes hundreds of years, it is important to actively maintain the conversation and the discourse around it, in order to at least make it harder to have this kind of denialism and revisionism. And I think the fact that this is gaining so much ground at the moment reflects a broad set of societal challenges, and transitional justice isn't equipped to deal with all of them, and it shouldn't. And so again, it's like one part of this broad transition process that takes really long, because changing mindsets and attitudes, and really how we treat each other as people, right? Yeah. That's a really long process. It's a really hard task, and a lot of violence has different kind of patterns like racism and things underlying it that are really, really hard to change, unfortunately, and they take really long. So I think it doesn't mean that transitional justice sort of failed at the educational work. I think it's just meeting a new context where we have to rethink how we talk about the past, or need new ways to frame it, or to bring it back into attention, and the consequences of violence. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's an innate failure of transitional, the educational work of transitional justice, but it does certainly show some of the shortcomings,
mm-hmm.
And poses new questions in terms of how do we do that, and how do we position a conversation about the truth of the past in as you say, a post-truth context where any notion of truth is being challenged. And at the same time, we want to give space to truths within a plural, right?
Sure. This is, I think, the key, that there can be multiple truths. Yeah. No, it's very interesting. Maybe a very concrete question, another concrete question from my side, and then we can move to the more concluding question afterwards. So also another key things which is being discussed in our society here in Georgia and in the region overall is also access to archives. This is, and this is, I think, the key, obviously, to kind of basically having the full picture about the past, and especially the recent past. So how it's been instrumentalized from your experience, this access to archives, and how important are access to archives? Like whether is it primary for the, let's say, this truth seeking, this and transitional justice?
That's a really good question. And I think it is a primary concern, because I think we all somehow intuitively know of the power of the archive. That's why they're being destroyed when people leave power or feel they have something to hide. That's why people, when, in East Germany, when the wall came down, were trying to, on the one side, government just destroy the archive, and the other side, the people storming the archive to preserve it. Like, I think powerful actors, but also people in their everyday lives, are quite aware of the power of the archive. And so access is really key. And because the archives, I mean, many of the archives that we use in transitional justice are produced by the powerful. They are a direct output and an enabler of the violence that they commit. So really, there's invaluable information in there on how the systems work, who is responsible for what. So it's definitely, I think, a really important part of transitional justice, but also of, even when there is no transitional justice, and transition, like, sort of as a preparatory work to try to preserve archives, so that maybe one day in the future we can use them. At the same time, I think there is a risk in having a narrow understanding of which archives are relevant, because it is not just those of the powerful, because a lot of people document and create their own archives, and they don't always look like what we think of as an archive, with shelves and folders and documents. That, people have very personal ways of recording their stories and documenting them, and I would argue that those are just as important, because the archives of the powerful reflect a very particular perspective. They tell us what those in power, those were who committing crimes, sort of, it reflects their logics, and it's a continuation of their violence. And so the stories of how people survive, of the bravery, the heroism of rebuilding life and holding on to life in these really hard times, are usually not reflected in those archives. And I think we want to be able to tell those stories as well. And so I think whether that perspective then comes from personal archives, from people collecting photos, from people, there's this idea of living archives, sort of in conversation, in relationship with each other, people maintaining memory, recording what happened to them and their families and their loved ones, and sort of asking them about it through testimonies, through different kinds of processes, through artworks. I think that's a really, really equally important part of having the conversation around what happened. So yes, the access to different kinds of archives is incredibly important, but we should not limit ourselves to what kind of archives we consider important and how what we understand to be an archive.
No, this is important observation. And lastly, the last question would be, you have extensive research conducted on dealing with the past across different, let's say, parts of the world. And can you name a few which you think were more or less successful, and what nuances were there which makes you to consider them as successful?
You're already pointing at the challenge of that, which is how we understand success and how we define it and how we measure it is incredibly complicated. It has a huge impact on whether we can say something was successful or not. And again, I think transitional justice claims to do very big things, right? Mm-hmm. Contribute or achieve peace and justice, reconciliation. And I think if we measure against these very abstract, idealistic concepts, then we often see transitional justice falling short, because I don't think there's a single example where a truth commission or a transitional justice process secured democracy, if you want to put it that way, for example, right? But I think there are many cases where transitional justice processes and institutions have made significant contributions to paving the way for all of these. And so, to me, I think the South African transition as a broader process would not have unfolded the way it did in a fairly peaceful way if it weren't for the Truth Commission. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think it has directly contributed to a sense of truth, visibility, reconciliation that was very impactful and important. I think that at the same time, that doesn't mean that the Truth Commission didn't have many flaws, and some of them only became visible over time, right? But I think some of those flaws were also related to the fact that things that should have followed the Commission didn't. Trials and prosecutions didn't really happen, which should have been part of the transitional justice process. Education reforms, land reform in South Africa, economic reforms were really missing from this jigsaw puzzle of what transitional justice should be. And so I think one important part is not to equate transitional and transitional justice, and again, to be realistic about what it can do, even if we need to hold on to sort of idealistic goals and conversations and discourses. But there's been a lot of research on the success of transitional justice, and again, it's sort of what measurements we use. The jury is sort of still out in terms of is it successful and how and under what circumstances. Some studies have found positive contributions of truth commissions or trials on factors like trust, justice, democracy. Others have pointed more towards negative or negligible impacts. So it really depends on our measurements. But I think, to mention just a few more examples in terms of context where I think we have seen positive contributions. If we think of Colombia, for example, that's had a really comprehensive effort to implement transitional justice processes and restore a sense of justice and accountability. There has been success there. Again, doesn't mean there aren't problems with the process, but I think there's a sense that justice is genuinely being pursued and to some in some instances achieved. I think Germany, again, if we want to come back to that, I think was sort of a catalyst for this idea of international criminal justice, right? What we now discuss as international criminal justice. Seeing the prosecutions of some of the worst perpetrators, which I think was restored a sense of justice. But at the same time, in post-Nazi Germany, many former Nazis were able to hold on to positions of power and influence, which challenges that. And then, yet again, up until now, we're still seeing prosecutions of people that were involved in the violence and the crimes. So, again, this then helps maintain that sense of justice. So I think there isn't a yes or no, or this is a successful case. This isn't one type of answer. But I think, we've seen a lot of institutions that have made really important contributions. They can't solve all the problems that they sometimes claim to be addressing. I think that's important. And it's not only about those big institutions either. Again, I think in Uganda, for example, we've had very localized processes of trying to reintegrate returning child soldiers or people that were abducted as young people, were forced to fight in the Lord's Resistance Army and then returned and had to sort of rebuild their life in a community that views them and viewed them with a lot of suspicion. And those mechanisms were very important in enabling some of that reintegration. And it doesn't mean that they're not still facing stigma and marginalization, but it was in that moment of return, still an important step, without which it might have been even worse.
Sure. Thank you so much for this interesting talk. I don't have any more questions because I think it's a lot to take in, actually. To maybe if some listeners who would be interested, they can research on their own some of the topics which we touched upon. And I think for me the major takeaway is that transitional justice can be a never-ending process. It's something that goes in hand with kind of everydayness in politics, and it comes in many forms of justices. It's not, which you mentioned, only a political one or the legal one. I think the economic one, social, and so on are very important pieces of the puzzle as well. And so thank you, Ulrike, for this very interesting talk. If you have any last comments to make, great. Then I wish you lots of success in your further research. Thank you for this conversation, and good luck.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the interesting questions and for having me.
Thank you.